A bright flash, and then it was all over. A more than 15 years long safety streak in American commercial aviation erased in seconds as the entangled pieces of a helicopter and an airliner tumbled down towards the freezing Potomac River. And what led up to this horrifying accident is as infuriating as it is complex. The 29th of January 2025 was a gloomy day in Wichita, Kansas. A light rain was drizzling down over the airport when, at around 16:30, the crew of PSA Airlines Flight 5342 reported for duty for the flight towards Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. This was going to be their third day working together out of a 4-day pairing, and the two pilots were reportedly in a good mood as they started looking through the briefing material. The captain was 34 years old and had been working for PSA Airlines for almost exactly 6 years at this point. He had first gotten his command back in 2022 on the CRJ 700 that they were now about to operate, and so far he had accumulated 3,950 hours of total time, of which just over 3,000 had been flown on this very type. He was described by his colleagues as a skilled aviator who followed procedures and had excellent crew resource management skills. And his colleague on this day, the first officer, was 28 years old and had been working for PSA Airlines for about 2.5 years at this point. During that time, he had built up a total experience of just under 2,500 hours, of which 965 were on the CRJ, and captains that had flown with him described him as standard to the T, incredibly sharp and an overall very good first officer. Now, these two pilots had worked late shifts during the preceding days, but had also had plenty of rest, so nothing indicates that they were feeling fatigued or out of shape in any way. So as they were now preparing their paperwork, they were likely just feeling that combination of focus and anticipation that we pilots all feel before a duty starts. In any case, there was nothing that stood out as different or noteworthy in the pilot's briefing pack. The weather in Washington was okay, with good visibility and a reasonably high cloud base, but there were some strong and gusty northwesterly winds forecasted. So based on that, they decided that the captain would be pilot flying for the leg, with the first officer handling the radios as pilot monitoring. They then briefed their two cabin crew colleagues and after that walked out to the aircraft that was waiting for them out on the apron. Once there, the security checks were done in a normal fashion and the passengers started boarding, so when the doors were finally closed, there were a total of 64 souls on board. At the same time as Flight 5342 were getting ready, a crew of a very different aircraft was also preparing for their duty. These were 3 officers of the B Company, 12th Aviation Battalion of the U.S Army, based out of Davison Army Airfield in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and they were gearing up for an annual evaluation flight for one of the officers on a Sikorsky Uniform Hotel 60 Lima military helicopter. This flight, which would have call sign Priority Air Transport or PAT-25, would evaluate several things, including flights using night vision goggles or NVGs, and it would be flown primarily visually, which is an important detail here. Now, like I said, there were 3 officers planned to operate this evening flight. The pilot, who like I mentioned was going to be evaluated and therefore would be mainly pilot flying, was 28 years old and held a commercial FAA helicopter license as well as both a civilian and military rating on this particular helicopter type. At the time, she held the rank of captain and had been assigned to the 12th Battalion back in 2019. She had then steadily moved up through the ranks and was at the time of this flight the platoon leader for a newly formed Petroleum, Oils and Lubricants platoon. But she remained with the B Company's aircrew training program for flying purposes. She had initially, several years ago, had some documented training issues, mainly to do with her stick and rudder skills, but had since overcome those, and during the years prior to this flight, she had received generally good feedback on her flying on several different evaluations. But having said that though, she only had 454 hours of total time, of which 326 had been flown in this helicopter. And she had flown just 4.4 hours within the preceding 60 days, so she might have felt a little bit rusty here. Anyway, she reported for duty at time 1300 hours, and during the morning that day, she had talked to her partner, who remembered that she sounded really happy and excited about the check flight, and she had even calmed him down when he expressed some worry about the windy conditions on the day. The second crew member in the helicopter was a 39-year-old instructor pilot who would be doing the evaluation on the pilot flying and therefore was going to sit in the right seat as pilot monitoring. He had a total experience of just under 1,000 hours, of which 301 had been flown on this particular type, and at the time he held the rank of Chief Warrant Officer, assigned to the same B company as the pilot flying was. His colleagues described him as by the book and generally quite good, and the battalion standardization pilot described him as one of his best instructors. On the day of this flight, he checked in around the same time as the other pilot did, and was described by the team who helped with the dispatch as very alert and generally in a very good mood. The third and final member of the helicopter crew was a 28-year-old crew chief with the rank of Staff Sergeant. He had joined the B company as a helicopter mechanic and had since become a crew chief and instructor with a total experience of 1,149 hours. Now, having recently completed his own evaluation flight, which he had passed with flying colors, he was considered by the battalion's standardization pilot as one of the best and most intelligent instructors that he had ever worked with. He had also signed in between 1,300 and 1,400 hours, and his job on this flight would be similar to what a flight engineer would do back in the day on an aircraft. Do the walk around, check weight and balance, as well as fuel management, read checklists and so on. But he should also help with airspace surveillance and visually look for obstacles and traffic. Now, all of these pilots, including the two in the CRJ, had valid medicals and were in good physical shape, so their health had nothing to do with what was soon about to happen. But the involved aircraft would. So before we continue, let's have a bit of a closer look at them, shall we? The CRJ 700 is a modern narrow-body twin jet with a full glass cockpit, and the one that was going to be used on this flight was 20 years old and had no relevant technical issues with it. It was equipped with a traffic alert and avoidance system called TCAS-2 version 7.0, and it worked via a transponder radio box inside which would communicate with other nearby transponders to give warnings about conflicting traffic. This TCAS system would then show relevant traffic on its display, and if any aircraft would come within a certain range or altitude, generally within 45 seconds of a projected collision, a so-called traffic warning would be issued, which would change the symbol shape and color on the screen together with a loud automatic traffic call. Now, the idea, if such a warning would be issued, was that the pilot should not change their trajectory yet, but instead start looking for the traffic and get ready for the possible next step, which would be what we call a resolution advisory. That would come if the involved aircraft would continue to come closer, and it would activate around 25 seconds or so before a projected collision. If that would happen, the two transponders in the conflicting aircraft would start to coordinate with each other. So one would, for example, tell its pilots to climb, while the other would tell its crew to descend. And this would be accompanied by the involved aircraft turning red on the TCAS display, together with an indication showing how much to either climb or descend. Now, this is a fantastic system that has undoubtedly saved countless lives over the years, but by 2025 it was also a bit obsolete. You see, the TCAS system can't give more specific verbal information about the direction and trajectory of the conflicting traffic, so in order for the pilots to figure that out, they would have to look down onto their screens, process that information, and then look up to try and find the target. And on top of that, TCAS doesn't show directional vectors on the screen, so to figure out which way a target was moving, you need to kind of keep watching it, to let it move on the screen a bit in order to determine that. But there is actually a substantially improved system out there. Tomorrow's TCAS system, if you will, and that is called ACAS-X. This system can do all of the things that TCAS can, but instead of only allowing the transponders of equipped aircraft to talk to each other, it also utilizes a system called ADS-B out and ADS-B in. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it short. ADS-B stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, and it is in easy terms the system that allows apps like Flight Radar 24 to work. It utilizes upgraded capabilities inside of modern transponders who sends out a lot more information about the flight than it did before. And that information being sent out is what's referred to as ADS-B out. And that is what's required for ACAS to work fully. ADS-B in is then the ability to take in all of that information and to display it. So, using this, an installed ACAS X system would be able to send out not just a generic traffic warning, but instead a much more detailed description. Something like target at 2 o'clock, 200 feet below, moving east. And that would obviously make it much easier to find the conflicting traffic without having to look down. On top of that, the depiction of traffic on the screens would also be far more detailed, and another benefit of this system would be less spurious traffic warnings, since this system can filter out nearby traffic that, due to its trajectory, actually isn't a threat, which would make any warnings that we do get much more relevant. So, if this ACAS system is so great, then why hasn't it become standard? Well, the sad answer is because of bureaucracy. The Minimum Operational Performance Standards, or MOPS, which is the benchmark a system needs to meet, were completed for ACAS already back in 2018. But the EASA in Europe didn't recognize it as a suitable collision avoidance standard until March of 2025, which obviously then stopped all of the major aircraft manufacturers from implementing it until that point. And even though it will likely now start showing up, there is, at the time that we filmed this, still no regulatory requirement to actually start shifting over from TCAS to ACAS. And when something expensive is not mandated, it likely won't happen. Now that was a bit of an excursion, but I think it's really important that you understand all of the horrifying bureaucracy and politics which built the foundation for this accident. Because this was far from the only thing. Now, I'll get back to that in a second, but when we're on the subject of new and better systems, let me ask you something. Have you ever been arriving from a flight to a new country, trying to send a message home, checking hotel details or hailing a cab, just to realize that you don't have any mobile data? So you end up having to log on to some slow, unsecured local Wi-Fi network, or the horror, pay for roaming. Well, with today's sponsor, Saily, those days are over. Saily is an incredible eSIM service from the creators of NordVPN, and with their app, you'll have access to instant mobile data in over 200 countries. No more physical SIM cards or roaming fees. This is how it works. So, first, you download the Saily app, and then you just pick your destination and choose your data plan. They've got options from a few days or weeks, and if you're hitting multiple countries at once, their global or regional plans will let you travel with the same eSIM plan. And of course, coming from the creators of NordVPN, Saily wouldn't be complete without a suite of included security features that will keep your browsing activity private, allows you to change your virtual location, block malicious ads, and help you stay safe with their web protection from one of the leading VPN services around. Right now, you will get a 15% discount using the code PILOT at checkout when you scan this QR code or go to saily.com/pilot. Thank you, Saily. Now let's get back to the video. The Sikorsky Uniform Hotel 60 Lima is an older military helicopter equipped with a 4-bladed main rotor connected to 2 General Electric Aerospace T700 GA701D turboshaft engines. Its instrumentation is mainly analog, fed from external pitot-static sensors, who are then routed through computers that interpret the signals and feeds them into several subsystems, like a stabilization augmentation system, instruments, and the pilot's head-up displays. Now I could go into a lot more detail here, but I will only touch on the most relevant things of this helicopter that you need to know. First, it was equipped with a Mode S and ADS-B out capable transponder that should work well with the TCAS system, but the helicopter itself didn't have TCAS installed, and it later turned out that the transponder that was fitted on board wasn't working properly at the time of this flight either. So, even though it did send out a Mode S signal, its ADS-B out functionality wasn't there. Secondly, and this is really important, you have to understand how the barometric altimeters on board any aircraft, but in particular on this helicopter, works. A barometric altimeter is, in its most simple form, a pressure meter that senses changes in the surrounding static pressure and indicates that on the altimeter instruments on board. Now, since the pressure in the atmosphere changes every day, a special reference pressure value needs to be continuously calculated by each airport and then transmitted to the aircraft in order to allow their altimeters to show the correct pressure altitude above sea level. This reference pressure is known as QNH, and it is either given as hectopascals in Europe or millimeters of mercury in the US. So, if that pressure is set correctly, well then the barometric altimeters will indicate a reasonably correct pressure altitude. But only if the static pressure can be measured in an undisturbed location. Now, as you can imagine, that can be hard to achieve on a helicopter in flight, which is constantly being affected by the downwash from its own rotor blades. So, on this particular helicopter, the effect of this was that at lower speeds, the three pressure altimeters on board tended to underread a bit, meaning that the helicopter would actually be higher up than indicated by as much as 80 feet. That misindication would then reduce as the forward speed increased, but in the case of this particular helicopter, there was also another issue. And that was that it was equipped with an external stores support system, or ESSS, which was basically two small wings with tanks on them. Now, this actually changed the aerodynamic properties of the helicopter, specifically from the downwash, and therefore it added to those overreading issues. Combined, it could lead to the pilots reading a pressure altitude that was a full 100 feet too low. And this altitude was then also transmitted through the helicopter's transponder to air traffic control and any TCAS-equipped aircraft around. Now, this fact wasn't indicated anywhere in the cockpit, and when checked by maintenance, the system always performed correctly, as those checks tended to be done on the ground with the engines shut off, so no downwash. Now, there were also 3 radar altimeters installed in the helicopter who measured the height above the ground using radio waves. But those were not routinely used for navigation, since they would fluctuate due to the terrain underneath, and most clearances were given in reference to sea level. But apart from those issues though, this 24-year-old helicopter was in a generally good shape, as the 3 pilots now started getting it ready for their evening mission. Around time 1845, they then departed from Davison and started flying west towards a private grass field in Culpeper, Virginia, with the pilot flying in the left-hand seat, the instructor pilot in the right seat, and the crew chief in his seat likely to the left behind the pilot flying. After a quick landing in Culpeper, they then proceeded north for a while, executing some air work, and then continued due east, where they landed at a heliport in Laytonsville, Maryland, around time 2025. And only 3 minutes later, they then took off again and started flying back towards Washington, D.C. Now, whilst we don't have much details about those initial parts of the flight, everything seems to have been running smoothly. Just 7 minutes before the helicopter departed its base, PSI American Airlines Flight 5342, with call sign Blue Streak 5342, had also taken off from Wichita and was now climbing eastwards towards its cruising altitude. And as far as we can tell, the climb, cruise and initial descent of that flight seems to have gone off without any issues at all. So at around time 2030, both of these aircraft were approaching DC, but from different directions. One flying visually, partially along established corridors that we will get to in a while, and one following air traffic control clearances, descending according to instrument flight rules. Now, before we get into what ultimately happened here, it is super important that you understand what kind of airport and airspace that these 2 aircraft were now getting closer to. Obviously, Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States and therefore home to its various political power centers, like the White House, Congress, Capitol Hill and the Pentagon. And because of that, it has over the years become a prestigious and important destination for airlines, as well as a busy place for all sorts of VIP military and police helicopter traffic. Washington National, or DCA, which was Flight 5342's destination, is the most centrally located of Washington's 5 major airports, sitting only 3 nautical miles away from downtown, and It was therefore a favorite destination for politicians traveling in from their various states. And possibly as a direct result of that, the traffic into DCA during the previous decades had radically changed. Back in 1991, DCA handled just over 285,000 IFR operations, and by 2024, that number had risen slightly to just over 298,000, which was an increase of only around 4.4%. This meant that the big change here was not the total number of aircraft movements, but instead the type of traffic that was using the airport. In 1991, air carrier operations accounted for about 175,000 movements, or roughly 61% of DCA's IFR traffic, and the rest was made up of a mix of air taxi, general aviation, and a small number of military flights. But by 2024, air carrier operations had risen to more than 294,000 movements, which meant almost 99% of the IFR traffic. And at the same time, air taxi and general aviation had almost disappeared, falling from more than 110,000 combined movements in 1991 to less than 4,000 in 2024. Now that matters, because not all movements create the same amount of operational pressure. A small general aviation aircraft or air taxi flight is not the same as a steady stream of airliners, mostly using DCA's main, longer runway. So even though the overall number of IFR operations had barely changed, the airport had during this period become far more dominated by scheduled airline traffic, and thus more congested. But whilst that certainly played a main role here, another important reason was political pressure. You see, DCA has been a so-called slot-limited airport for decades, meaning that the movements there were limited and controlled by Congress. And according to our sources, Congress had for many years been adding more slots, in spite of protests from airport officials, seemingly in order to win votes from Congress members who would then stand to personally benefit from more flights being added to their home districts. In fact, Flight 5342 was likely such a flight, having been added in 2023 or 24 after lobbying by Kansas representatives. So politics definitely played a role here. But whilst other airports could maybe accommodate that type of growth by adding another runway or terminal, this was not the case at Washington National. You see, that airport is built on a peninsula out in the middle of the Potomac River, and originally it had 3 active runways. Runway 0119, which is the main runway, runway 1533, which is the shorter crossing runway, and runway 0422, which at the time of this story was only being used for takeoffs from the runway 04 direction. Now, as you can see here, there was no space to add anything on this location, which meant that DCA had over the decades become more and more space constrained. So, how do you think all of this was handled then? Well, the traffic flowing into DCA was first handled by a controller facility known as Potomac Tracon, and it funneled that traffic in from higher levels and provided vectors to space them up until they were then around 5 nautical miles away from DCA, where the local tower controller would take over. Now, the DCA tower had asked Potomac to provide at least 4 nautical miles of spacing in order to allow for some departures in between the landings. But that request was not always being adhered to, especially during the most busy periods of the day. So in order to keep traffic flowing during days with nice weather and when the airport was operating in its noddly configuration, the tower controllers had routinely started to ask airliners if they could accept to change over their landing runway from 01 to 33 instead. That would provide some extra space for takeoffs on the main runway without slowing down the arrivals, and would therefore solve the issue. Now, the airliners could of course refuse this if they weren't properly prepared or if their landing performance didn't allow it, but everyone generally tried to help out as much as they possibly could. Obviously, this doesn't sound ideal, and the Potomac Tracon had actually asked for a reduction in allowed flights into DCA already back in 2023. But they had then been told by district management that they should withdraw that request because it was, and I quote here, too political. So that was the situation when it came to fixed-wing aircraft and especially airliners, but what about the helicopter traffic then? Well, here is where things start to become really complicated and frankly a bit hard to understand. As you can imagine, there was a huge need for helicopter movements around this area for a multitude of different reasons. Everything from police helicopters to military VIP services to the Pentagon or the White House, ambulance transport, press helicopters, as well as general aviation, all flying around in this area, mainly according to visual flight rules. There was actually so much of that traffic that some kind of corridor system had to be implemented just in order for air traffic control to be able to keep track of everyone and also to give quick, understandable clearances to the helicopters without clogging up the frequency. Now, the airspace around DCA was classified as Class B, meaning it was highly controlled. So anyone needing to move through that airspace needed air traffic control clearances to do so. Now, the way that this was implemented in reality was through so-called helicopter routes that had been created following clear visual landmarks like the Potomac River and various bridges. And the routes that will become especially important for this story is Route 1, which was going along the Potomac River via Key Bridge, the Memorial Bridge, which was a mandatory reporting point, then the tidal basin, and finally down towards the pointy end of an island known as Hans Point. At that point, a four-way crossing followed, where a helicopter could either be cleared to turn west overhead the DCA airport or proceed over the city. But if a helicopter wanted to continue following the river south, in the direction towards U.S Army airfield, well then it needed to descend down to a maximum of 200 feet and proceed via Route 4 instead, which would take it below the approach path for runway 33 in DCA. The exact origin of these corridors was a little bit hard to find, but my team have tracked up sources which seems to indicate that they weren't created by the FAA to begin with, but instead by the military. And the FAA then just adopted them at some point after unclear risk assessment. Now, these helicopter routes were not specifically defined in terms of how wide they were, nor were they shown on any IFR charts that the aircraft pilots carried. There were indicated maximum altitudes and a verbatim description of the route to be followed, but as was later found out, even if a helicopter would maintain the maximum altitude of 200 feet on Route 4 as indicated on their chart, that would only give 75 feet of separation from the 3-degree approach path into runway 33 at DCA, and only at the part of the route closest to the river shore. Further out, that margin reduced significantly. Now, in later interviews, several helicopter pilots indicated that they had assumed that the maximum altitude of those charts would keep them clear of traffic, which, as it turns out, was not the case. But what all of that meant was that in practice, a helicopter couldn't be cleared to follow Route 4 when there was landing traffic on runway 33. So the tower controllers were therefore left with the choice of either giving helicopters a holding pattern when this was the case, or to ask them to stay visually clear of the approaching traffic. Something that required significantly less monitoring by the controller and helped the traffic flow better, which is worth remembering here. And there had been a lot of incidents involving helicopters and airliners at DCA over the years. Between January of 2018 and February of 2025, over 4,000 instances had been recorded where aircraft had come within 1,000 feet of a helicopter. And in 348 of those, they had ended up closer than 500 feet. That's over 5 times per month. And even though loads of those close calls had then generated formal reports, the FAA and the military had still not recognized this as a potential serious safety issue, which points to obvious problems with the safety management systems within those organizations. In fact, back in 2013, a regional jet had almost collided with a military helicopter in the area, and that had led to a DCA Tower Helicopter Working Group requesting that Route 4 should be moved away from the approach path of runway 33, but that request ultimately led nowhere. Now, I'm guessing that quite a few of you are quietly shaking your heads right now, and you would be right to do so because this is outrageous. And the only reason that my team and I have been able to find for these routes to not having been changed earlier was that the FAA likely would have had to coordinate that with all of the airspace users around the DCA, and that included the military, who saw these routes as being a national security requirement and therefore superseding the need for civilian air traffic. In fact, that was likely why PAT 25 was training in this area in the first place, and the only ones who could change matters of national security would be the Department of Defense, Congress, or the President. But no matter why, all of those things that I have just described had created a very complex airspace around DCA with loads of different types of air traffic constantly flowing in and out. And that finally brings me to the next main characters of this story, the air traffic controllers. There were actually 5 people present in the tower on this evening, but the ones I will focus on are the ones who were actually working with the airborne aircraft around time 2030, as these 2 involved aircraft were getting closer to DCA. First, we have the local controller, who at the time was in charge of both helicopter traffic and IFR traffic approaching DCA in what's known as a combined position. He was 36 years old and had been working at the DCA tower since 2022. On this day, he had started his duty around 1400 and had then rotated through different positions until finally starting in the combined local and helicopter control position around time 1928. This meant that he had been in that position for little over an hour at the time PSA Flight 5342 came onto his frequency. He was then supported by a 41-year-old assistant local controller, who also had been working in the DCA tower since 2022. She had signed in at the same time as the local controller and had also been rotating through different positions. At the time Flight 5342 was approaching, she was supposed to support the local controller, but also do some administrative tasks like record helicopter movements. Now, on top of these 2 active controllers, there was also a 36-year-old operations supervisor in the tower, whose job it was to provide operational supervision, make sure everything worked efficiently, and crucially, decide on when the helicopter and local control positions should be combined or separated to involve 2 separate controllers. To do this, he needed to maintain constant situational awareness and to monitor his colleagues' workload, but a detail that is really important to note here is that whilst the controllers needed to change positions and have regular breaks to make sure that they stayed alert, there were no such clear rules for the supervisor. So at the time that these 2 aircraft got into the DCA airspace, he had been on that same position for around 2 hours and was possibly starting to lose a little bit of focus. So why is that important then? Well, like I said, it was his duty to decide on if the local controller should also handle helicopter traffic. And whilst there previously had been documentation needed to support when decisions of combined or split duties were taken, that was no longer the case at this time. So we don't really know how he was reasoning here. But what we do know is that whilst the complexity of the traffic increased around time 2030, the supervisor never picked that up. So the roles stayed combined. Of course, there were pros and cons with that. A combined position could be good for situational awareness, as only one controller would have the whole picture of what was going on in his airspace and would therefore not need to coordinate with another controller. But that's only efficient up to a certain point, after which it becomes overwhelming instead. During the time leading up to the accident, the local controller was dealing with first 8 different aircraft and helicopters, increasing to 10 about 13 minutes before, then dropping back down to 8, to finally increase to 10 and then 12 in the last 90 seconds. Just to give you an idea, that meant that he was making about 7.7 separate transmissions per minute, which is a lot. Another detail that is worth noting here is that while the local controller was doing this, he was using 2 separate frequencies for helicopters and aircraft on approach. And that meant that whilst both helicopters and aircraft could hear him transmitting on both, they couldn't hear the responses from the other frequency. So if a clearance was given to a helicopter, for example, an aircraft on final couldn't hear the helicopter's readback, only its clearance, and vice versa. So with all of this said, it's now time to get back into the air and follow what happened to Pat 25 and Bluestreak 5342 as they were now flying in over the dense lights of central Washington. At time 20:30 and 19 seconds, Pat 25 tried calling up the DCA tower for the first time, requesting flight following back to their base at Davison. But for some reason that call was never registered, which was likely a good thing since they didn't need flight following, but instead a proper clearance through the Class B airspace. Now the cockpit voice recorder indicates that this first request was made by the pilot in the left seat, who apparently was working as pilot monitoring at that time, but that was soon about to change. In any case, there seems to have been a relaxed and friendly atmosphere in the helicopter at the time, and both the operating pilots were using night vision goggles at this point, who limits the field of vision to about 40 degrees, but greatly enhances outside cues during darkness. Those NVGs were fixed on their helmets, so the pilots could glance down on their instruments without them, but still use them whilst looking straight ahead or outside. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning, this helicopter was not equipped with TCAS, nor did it have any fancy navigational display, but records from the pilot's base indicate that a ADS-B Stratus receiver was missing after the accident, and 2 iPad minis with the 4Flight app were later recovered. So it is possible that the pilots were using these strapped to their knee boards to help with navigation and traffic awareness, which was something that several military pilots later testified that they often did. Now the 4Flight app has the capability to give traffic warnings and info using ADS-B in, but if it was used, those tablets wouldn't have been connected to the pilots' helmets anyway, so any oral warnings wouldn't have been heard. The helicopter was now descending down to about 1,500 feet in order to get ready to join helicopter route 1. And at time 20:32, the pilots again tried reaching the tower, this time successfully. Pat 25 now requested to proceed via route 1 to Davison, and the controller responded by giving them the local QNH for their altimeters, 29.89, and then asked for their position. But that message was really garbled and full of static, so the helicopter crew didn't really hear what the controller was saying. And because of that, the pilot in the left seat just read back, Pat 25, proceed as requested, which was not what the controller had said, and the 2 pilots then continued chatting about the poor quality of the radio. At time 20:32 and 50 seconds, the instructor pilot then seemed to have decided that it was time for the pilot in the left seat to take over the controls. It is possible that she had taken the radio for a while in order to be evaluated on her pilot monitoring duties, and that it was now time for her to be flying again. About a minute later, the controller called Pat 25 back up again and asked them to squawk ident, which is when a button is pushed on the transponder to help identify a radar return on the controller screen. Remember, he had already asked for their position before. The pilots complied, whilst also responding to the call, and the controller soon called out their position and asked them to repeat their request. Now, whilst this was going on, there were a multitude of other calls from aircraft and helicopters, both from the ground and in the air, so the local controller was now already becoming really busy. Pat 25 repeated their request for route 1, which the controller quickly approved, but the calls were still partially blocked by static and poor radio quality. So the pilots continued to talk about that as they proceeded along their route. At the same time, the pilots of PSA Flight 5342 had now entered the Potomac Tracon control area and were descending south of Washington Dulles Airport. The approach preparations were completed, with the crew having set up and briefed for a Mount Vernon visual approach for runway 01 at DCA, but given that both of these pilots were experienced with DCA operations, it is likely that they had also discussed the possibility of having to brake right for a left-hand visual circling in for runway 33, since that happened pretty often. Anyway, everything was still going according to plan at this point for them, so let's get back to the helicopter. Because around time 2038, it had reached a point called Cabin John, where they were supposed to turn east to join route 1, but now instead turned west. The instructor pilot quickly caught this and asked where they were going, which made the pilot flying realize her mistake and initiate a sweeping left turn back onto an easterly track. But those extra few seconds there would soon come to have some truly dire consequences. The helicopter now descended down to an altitude of 800 feet and continued following the Potomac River along Route 1. And at the same time as PAT-25 was doing that little detour, Flight 5342 was coming towards the end of a long downwind vector, and we're just about to get an instruction from the Tracon to turn left and intercept the localizer for the Mount Vernon visual approach for runway 01. Yeah, the localizer could be used for this even though it was a visual approach, as long as the aircraft would then turn left at a distance of 5.9 nautical miles from the DCA VOR and start following the river instead. I'm guessing for noise reasons. So at time 2039, this was exactly what these pilots were cleared to do, after which they were also told to switch over to the DCA tower controller. Down in the tower at this time, the local controller was dealing with 9 different aircraft, of which 4 were helicopters in different positions, and Flight 5342 was now about to become the 10th aircraft. It was approaching peak arrival rates, and the controller was now struggling to keep the distance between the landing aircraft down to 4 miles to enable him to let departures go. So, by this point, he had now started to ask aircraft on approach to runway 01 if they would be able to circle over to runway 33 instead for landing. As that was going on, PAT-25 was continuing along its route, and their reception of the radio transmissions had not gotten any better. On top of this, the relatively strong wind was now starting to affect the pilot flying's handling, with the instructor pilot intervening to provide some gentle feedback. Now I'm pointing that out, because if the pilot flying was feeling a bit rusty and was struggling a bit here, it would take up more of the instructor pilot's capacity, and with that, his ability to monitor for traffic. The tower local controller continued to give landing and departure clearances, trying to coordinate an increasingly complex traffic picture. And in the helicopter cockpit, the pilots were now discussing the location of another helicopter, as well as planning their continued routing after Route 1, which would become Route 4. And this meant that they wanted to continue straight ahead after reaching Hans Point via the route that was crossing below the final for runway 33. As they discussed this, they also continued their descent, commenting that they needed to pass the chain bridge at 700 feet and then the key bridge at 300. After that, they would then need to come down even further to 200 feet before proceeding on to Route 4. Now at time 20:43 and 6 seconds, Flight 5342 called up the DCA tower frequency, reporting that they were established on the Mount Vernon visual for runway 01. At that point, they were following the localizer still, just a mile or so south of Fort Washington, descending according to the procedure. And the tower local controller responded by giving them the current wind of 320 degrees at 17, gusting 25, and he then asked them if they could possibly take runway 33 for landing. But the pilots didn't immediately respond to that. Instead, whilst the tower continued communicating with another flight that had just landed, the 2 pilots started discussing this internally. The captain, who remembered was pilot flying, asked the first officer if they had the numbers, meaning the landing performance, to do it, and the first officer answered, "Yeah, I think so," followed by, "Yeah, it's the same numbers." And now comes what, in my view, is the most heartbreaking part of this entire story. Because the captain's response to the first officer's check of the performance figures was, "I really don't want to, but I guess tell them." The first officer tried to support his colleague's gut instinct by saying, I can just tell them," likely meaning that he could just say no. But the captain, in a characteristic act of team play, filled in, "Nah, it's fine. We got the numbers for it. Yeah, tell them we're fine. We'll do 3-3. We'll do it." Now, we all know what this would end up meaning, and I'm not saying that this was the wrong thing to do. Far from it. I would have likely done exactly the same thing. But it does underscore a point that I think is going to become more and more important in the coming years. You see, as pilots, we build up subconscious feelings for situations as we gain experience, and sometimes those feelings indicate clearly either a positive or a negative inclination around a sudden opportunity, in this case the circling approach. And I would suggest that we should listen to that little voice far more often than we do, because if something doesn't feel right, it's likely that our subconscious has picked up on a threat that our conscious mind still hasn't. Now in this case, it likely had nothing to do with traffic, but was instead a feeling about doing a more complicated approach into a shorter runway in gusty conditions, but that is enough. If there isn't enough spacing available for departures, that's not really the pilot's problem. And as I have already explained, this was a systemic issue at this airport, something that should be fixed by allowing less aircraft in, not pilots and controllers trying to patch the issue with more complex maneuvering. But instead, the first officer now called up the controller and accepted the circling, to which the controller replied, "Bluestreak 5342, at the Wilson Bridge, change to circle runway 33, and runway 33 cleared to land." The first officer read this back, and since the landing clearance was now issued, there would be no more need for the controller to talk to this flight until after its landing. At the same time, inside the cockpit of Pat 25, the turbulence had now gotten worse as they were getting lower, and the two pilots were discussing how to deal with it. And that discussion happened at the very same time as the tower cleared flight 5342 to land. Now remember, the helicopter and aircraft could not hear each other's transmissions, only the towers, so the only thing the helicopter pilots would have heard, if they were listening, would have been the tower's clearance for Bluestreak 5342 to circle and land runway 33. And why is that important? Well, other Army helicopter pilots who were experienced on this route later testified that they were quite used to see approaching aircraft to runway 01, but far less used to see any aircraft coming in to runway 33. Which would be more to the left in the windscreen in a helicopter that was coming down Route 4 around Hans Point. In any case, the helicopter had now reached 300 feet, and whilst they were also looking for other helicopter traffic, they discussed the fact that this other traffic could have descended into the lights, meaning that the vast amount of other light sources in the area could easily hide the other traffic. And that, of course, also applied to them. Back in the cockpit of the CRJ, the pilots were now getting ready for landing, and the captain was looking outside in order to follow the visual cues needed for the visual approach. A task that had now become much harder since more maneuvering was needed for runway 33. And not only that, since runway 33 was a bit further away, he would now need to reduce his descent significantly in order to line with the descent path and poppies for that runway, which would also increase the workload. He now called out, 33, and a few seconds later, 1,000 feet at the highway, 500 over the church, reminding himself and his colleague of the stabilized criteria that they needed to maintain over certain landmarks. And then during the next few minutes, the CVR picked up how the pilots continued configuring their aircraft for landing and completed the before landing checklist, whilst the tower controller directed his attention towards traffic on the runway, who was now rolling out after landing, as well as on other helicopters and departing traffic on his two frequencies. At time 20:45 and 27 seconds, the CRJ captain disconnected the autopilot and started turning right in order to fly the rest of the circling maneuver manually. Now some people might question that, but in this case it would definitely have been the easiest thing to do. Making small and smooth adjustments to descent and turn rates are just way easier when you're flying manually. But of course, this would also mean that the workload on the first officer would increase, since it was now up to him to make sure that they stayed stabilized, that they were on track, and that all of the checks were completed, which in turn now meant that he had less time to look outside. Pat 25 had by this point passed the northeast corner of Roosevelt Island and was now reaching 200 feet, which was the maximum altitude to keep during their transition over onto Route 4. And at time 20:45 and 14 seconds, the instructor pilot reported their position as Memorial Bridge, which the tower controller read back whilst the instructor pilot continued coaching the pilot flying on the use of rudder in gusty winds and turbulence. They then initiated a left turn towards the tidal basin, where the instructor pilot called out some cranes and that they were a bit too high, at 300 feet, asking his colleague to calm down a bit. So with all of these instructions, it's likely that most of his attention was now directed at the obstacles and the pilot flying, and not that much on the traffic. But what about the crew chief then? Well, there weren't many calls from him recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, and it's possible that he was just allowing the instructor pilot to do his thing, whilst he continued monitoring system performance, etc. His view out through his window would have also been slightly obscured by those extra fuel tanks, and as he was likely sitting behind the pilot, the helicopter structure would have obscured a big part of the runway 33 approach path once the helicopter was facing southwest. The two aircraft were now getting quite close to each other, so at time 20:46 and 1 second, the local controller called up Pat 25 and advised them, "Pat 25, traffic just south of Wilson Bridge is a CRJ at 1,200 feet circling for runway 33, which was a message that would have been heard on board Flight 5342 as well. But due to the poor quality of the radio transmissions, the word circling was never heard on board the helicopter, or at least it wasn't recorded on the CVR. And that is important, because that was a word that would have triggered the instructor pilot to look for the CRJ in a different place than all of the other aircraft that were lining up to land at DCA. We can never be sure, of course, but it is likely that the instructor pilot, upon hearing this message, now looked up, saw the landing lights of another approaching aircraft to runway 01, and therefore almost immediately responded, "Pat 25 has traffic in sight. Request visual separation." And to that, the controller quickly came back and said, "Visual separation approved." Now, at this point, the helicopter was passing the tidal basin and was about 6.5 miles away from Flight 5342, who was still proceeding to intercept the final approach for runway 33. It would have been one of 5 aircraft approaching from the south at this point, so distinguishing one from another would have likely been very hard. And knowing that, it's maybe a good idea here to discuss what the term visual separation would mean. Visual separation is one of those terms that fans of this channel know that I've mentioned before. It is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's where one or several aircraft make sure that they are not colliding with each other based on seeing each other and avoiding. Now, in theory, that's an okay tool, but it comes with many inherent issues, like relying on our fallible human senses to determine speed, distance and closure rate, as well as, of course, looking at the right target, especially at night and especially when using night vision goggles with a limited field of view. But at DCA at the time, the use of visual separation had become norm, something that relieved the local controller from having to issue holdings for the helicopters and therefore greatly helped the overall traffic flow. And also, likely subconsciously, reduced the controller's need to monitor the involved traffic as closely, since he could assume that they were keeping their own distance. It is also possible that some complacency had crept in here, because other Army helicopter pilots later testified that they would sometimes call traffic in sight, request visual separation, even before actually seeing this traffic, in order to facilitate traffic flow, since they knew where it would be. Can you see the holes in the Swiss cheese model starting to line up? As this was happening, the assistant controller in the tower was working on some administrative duties, and the supervisor didn't feel that the work rate for the controller was any higher than it normally would be. So the work just continued, with the controller now moving on to handling multiple other traffic, whilst assuming that Pat 25 had Flight 5342 clearly in sight. So he never gave any direct traffic information to the pilots in the CRJ. Back inside the helicopter, the instructor pilot commented on the traffic flow, saying, "He's got them stacked up tonight," to which the pilot flying responded, "Yeah, kinda busy." And the instructor then continued by talking about how the quartering gusty tailwind that they were experiencing was going to push them. So the pilot flying responded by crabbing a little bit into the wind whilst explaining how she was using her pedals. And that was all happening while the helicopter flew past Hans Point towards Route 4. Now remember here that crabbing into the wind, which was coming from their right, would mean yawing the helicopter more to the right, which would then also put Flight 5342's landing lights more to the left in their windows. The CRJ was now descending through 2,200 feet on their way towards runway 33, and I can tell you from my own experience that the focus of those two pilots would have mainly been on maintaining their speed and path here, as they were likely looking for the centerline and porpoise for the coming final descent. Several other helicopters now also caught up in quick succession to the tower, followed by an American Airlines flight which had just joined the final on runway 01. So the local controller was becoming increasingly busy, trying to keep everything in check. Just after Flight 5342 had turned final, its EGPWS system called out 500, which triggered the first officer to call out 500 feet on top of the bog, sinking 7, stable. Basically confirming that all parameters were stabilized for the coming landing. And to that, the captain responded, checks, all perfectly according to standard operating procedures. I really want to point out here that these two pilots were doing everything right, and they at this point had no idea of the danger that was coming towards them from below, but that was about to change. At time 20:47 and 33 seconds, a conflict alert went off in the tower, indicating that Pat 25 was now getting too close to the approaching airliner. This caused the controller to call up the helicopter saying, Pat 25, you have the CRJ in sight? Which could be heard with the conflict alert still beeping in the background. And he then continued by saying, Pat 25, pass behind the CRJ. Now it should also be mentioned here that a conflict alert was not something uncommon in this tower. It actually activated multiple times per day for a multitude of different reasons, so that in itself was likely not seen as something super serious. Again, as I have pointed out many times before, a warning system that sounds too often eventually stops working as a warning system at all, since people start taking it less seriously. In any case, as this warning was going off in the tower, inside the cockpit of Flight 5342, a TCAS, traffic warning, now also suddenly activated, but there would be no resolution advisory telling them to climb. This was because TCAS actually inhibits that function below 900 feet above ground, and even though the procedure for a traffic warning was to look for traffic and get ready for a possible maneuver, it is quite likely that the CRJ pilots just assumed that this warning was activated because of the holding helicopter, not something that was actually dangerous. And I think so because the CVR didn't pick up the pilots mentioning this TCAS alert at all, so they likely now just continued concentrating on the approach instead. After all, they had been cleared to land and had not received any direct traffic information about that helicopter sent to them specifically. But what about Pat 25 then? Well, when the controller told them to pass behind the CRJ, someone in the helicopter pressed their transmit button at the very same time, which effectively cancelled out the pass behind part of the message. So the only thing that they now heard was Pat, CRJ. Now the controller continued saying this separation, but that was not heard properly in either aircraft. And inside the helicopter, the instructor pilot now told the pilot flying, "Alright, come left for me, ma'am. I think that's why he's asking. We're kind of out towards the middle here." Likely referring to how far away they were from the shoreline. And that clearly showed that whatever he thought they were keeping visual separation from was not Flight 5342, which was now only seconds away to their left. But even if they were not looking at the CRJ, weren't they supposed to be separated vertically from the approach path anyway? Well, here is where that altimeter error that I mentioned before comes in. You see, the Army pilots would generally try to fly as accurately as possible at 200 feet, not lower, but with the relatively low speed that they were now flying and the external tanks attached, the downwash from the rotors were now likely causing their altimeters to underread, which meant that they were now actually flying straight into the path of Flight 5342 without any TCAS on board. Back in the cockpit of the CRJ, it would have been almost impossible to pick up the lights from the helicopter against the backdrop of city lights below, so even if the first officer would have tried, he likely wouldn't have been able to see it. At time 20:47 and 53 seconds, the helicopter banked slightly to the left and then continued steadily straight ahead with an indicated radio altitude of 278 feet. There were no sudden movements indicating that they saw what was coming towards them. But in the CRJ cockpit, 5 seconds later, the elevators were suddenly pulled sharply backwards, causing a deflection of 24 degrees in less than 1 second, and that was accompanied by sharp shouts from both of the captain and the first officer. This must have been the point where the helicopter suddenly appeared slightly to the right and below in front of them, but it was now too late. At time 20:48, the helicopter's main rotor blades slammed into the lower body and left wing of the CRJ, disintegrating as they did and causing immediate catastrophic damage to the wing. Control of both aircraft were therefore immediately lost in a bright flash, which could be clearly seen from inside of the tower. And 4 seconds later, it was all over. All 60 passengers and 4 crew on board Flight 5342 perished, together with the 3 crew members in the helicopter. This was a civilian air transport disaster of a magnitude that America hadn't seen since the horrible Colgan Air accident back in 2009. So the FAA, NTSB and the military now quickly got to work to try to figure out how something like this had been allowed to happen at one of the busiest airports in the country's capital. And the final report that they eventually produced is what I have used to tell you this story. It is an extraordinary document spanning 419 pages and produced in just over a year, which must be some kind of a record. In it, the NTSB eventually came with 74 new findings, but the probable cause was ultimately decided to have been the FAA allowing placement of a helicopter route in close proximity of an active approach path to a runway, together with an inability to regulate, review or evaluate helicopter routes, and a failure to mitigate the known risks of helicopter-to-aircraft mid-air collisions in the area. Several more contributing factors, most of whom I've already explained in this video, were also found, and this led to 57 new recommendations, one of which was the immediate abolishment of Helicopter Route 4, and the rest of them I will link to in the description below. But what I really want to highlight here are a few very important things. 1. The use of visual separation in highly complex environments at night and with loads of traffic is just not good enough. We have by now seen enough mid-air collisions to clearly establish that, and I sincerely hope that this will be the last one. 2. When new, better technologies like ACAS-X is available, or even the ADS-B in and out equipment that smaller aircraft are already using, well then it is the duty of the regulators to make sure that these technologies are implemented and required as quickly as possible. If both the helicopter and the aircraft in this story would have had that, it is highly likely that these new systems would have pointed out the evolving conflict both earlier and clearer, and with that, maybe this whole tragedy could have been avoided. And finally, Washington National Airport was allowed to grow beyond its safe capacity for years without any decision maker putting a stop to it, and that was even though some of the people involved clearly spoke up about it. This then meant that the traffic and size of aircraft grew, since it had become a status destination for senators from around the country, and with that, the safety margins had begun to shrink. Now, if functioning safety management systems would have been in place both within the military, the FAA and elsewhere, someone should have stepped up here and stopped it, but that sadly didn't happen. So I really hope that we have all learned from this now, so that clear warning signs are both picked up and acted on, and also that this will be the last time that I ever hear of a safety suggestion having been denied for political reasons. Now this was a tough one for us to do, especially since one of my team members had friends perish in this accident. So I really hope that you will walk away from this video understanding more of what really caused it. Now, if you want to help us to get even better and get to preview all of our new productions before anyone else, including Black Box, then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I'm actually just now planning a new Patreon hangout and I would love to see you there. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.